Hello, everyone. My name is Thompson, and I head up the brand and marketing team here at Royal Bank of Canada in our wealth management division. So thank you all very much for taking the time to be here in person, and also for those of you who are joining online now that we live in this hybrid world. RBC has been the proud principal partner of Masterpiece Fair for the last 9 years. And over the last 2 years, due to the pandemic, managed to deliver some wonderful digital content online, which we were blown away with the response from, hence we're here today extending that conversation. So deconstructing the world for emerging artists, deconstructing the art world for emerging artists was the theme of our digital content last year. And we're very lucky to have with us today some of the speakers and contributors who helped us deliver that program from RBC and also from Sotheby's Institute of Art and elsewhere, but I'll leave Corey to make the formal introductions. So please take the opportunity to ask questions in the room. This is very much going to be an interactive dialogue and conversation, so make sure you prepare those questions. We'll have microphones coming around so that you can share them. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Corey Jackson, who's the Senior Art Curator at RBC, based in Toronto in our head office. She's been here during Masterpiece doing tours with our clients and other guests, and she will introduce our speakers and start the conversation. Thanks again for being here.
Thanks so much, Prue. As Prue said, I'm Corey Jackson. I'm the Senior Curator of the RBC Collection, which is over 6,000 works in our offices globally. And I'm really excited to be here because the focus of our acquisitions is emerging artists. And I think a lot of the questions that we're going to discuss here today, I see as being so pertinent to a lot of the artists that we work with. So thanks for being here. And an additional welcome to everyone live streaming in. It's wonderful to be able to host this panel as an extension of last year's Emerging Artists series, which allowed for the creation of that educational masterclass focusing on addressing the challenges emerging artists face today. It was an opportunity to bring together RBC's longstanding commitment to supporting emerging artists through the RBC Foundation, which has been focused on that support since 2007. And our collaboration on this program has allowed us to leverage the exceptional network here at Masterpiece and the depth and breadth of expertise that's come to define the Sotheby's Institute of Art. So this dialogue is going to take the form of me introducing the panelists, having a Q&A, and then opening it up to the larger floor. And if you have questions and you're streaming in online, you're welcome to submit digitally as well, so please do so. I'm so thrilled that these three generous presenters are here to be able to have a live conversation. I think I watched all of the conversations digitally, and it's always so nice to be able to spend time face-to-face. But firstly, I'd like to introduce Julie Bentley. She's the co-founder and director of After, an arts body which promotes and supports recently graduated and early career artists through a public program of exhibitions and site-specific collaborations. She's also the owner and director of 163 Gallery, a private art space where selected artists are invited to make new and site-specific work as a means to explore and develop their practices. Julie's also a visiting lecturer at the Sotheby's Institute of Art. So welcome and thanks for being here. It was wonderful to kind of talk a little bit about that role that your gallery plays in commissioning work, and it's something really unique, and I look forward to diving into it a little bit further. With us also is Dr. Errol Francis. Dr. Errol Francis is the artistic director and CEO of Culture and, an organization that works in partnership with arts and heritage institutions and artists to develop programs that promote diversity in the workforce and expand audiences. Errol studied photography and fine art at Central St. Martin's School and the University of the Arts London. His doctoral research was at the Slade School of Fine Art, University College London, and focused on post-colonial artistic responses to museums. And of course, we also have Gareth Fletcher. Gareth lectures on a range of subjects across art logistics, art business at Sotheby's Institute of Art. In addition to his role as program director for MA in art logistics, he's the leader of the Art, Crime, and Art Technology from AI to NFTs online intensive course. I have a lot of questions for you. His current research explores the interface between the contextual information of cultural objects and technology and the integration of traditional art market processes with web applications. Such an interesting area, I think, as we're all navigating between the digital and the real to have as a part of the conversation today. Thank you so much for being with us. I know, given your backgrounds, you'll offer such great insights and also backgrounds as makers as well. I think that's really important for us to kind of ground the conversation. I'm going to go right into some questions, though, if that's okay, based on the conversations that you started through the online program and some of the topics that you raised. And Errol and Julie, when I was watching the programs and what you were speaking to, in your online tutorials, you really spoke in depth about the importance of community in supporting a practice. Creating a network of support is so essential for, I think, many professions, not just the visual arts. But could you both share some insights for young artists on key pieces for them to consider as they look to build their networks? Maybe Julie will start. Start with you, if that's okay. You're right here.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's really, it's impossible for you to have an artistic career, to build an artistic career without support. You can't do it on your own. So you have to sort of think about ways of collaboration when you think about sort of networking, and sort of really focus much more on not on selling, but on connecting. Connecting is the most important thing. The selling thing, that aspect will kind of come as a byproduct of all the connections that you make through networking. And when I sort of mean networking, I kind of also mean use networking as a way of honing your voice as an artist. So you get very used when you network to having to sort of do a slight sort of elevator pitch when you're talking to people, and you get very good at being able to sort of be very concise and become a sort of expert on your own practice in ways of developing and looking at the ways in which you're going to talk about your practice and understand your practice. So networking is a great way to sort of sound out your ideas as well. It's not just about sort of selling pitches to people. It's very much about sort of reaching out, connecting, discussing, and building up much more supportive relationships with people rather than seeing people as someone who might buy your artwork. I would say that.
Yeah, I'd follow on from that, actually. In terms of, the understanding the art world, I think, what do we mean by it, actually? What is one's art world? I think is an important part of it. I think Julie's mention of the market is probably the dominant, or the gallery system, the dominant understanding of what that means. And we work, as you've said, with diverse artists. And I think if you're kind of outside of that dominant network, then what is the art world to you, or how do you access it? I think part of it is you can kind of create your own network and world, and that's what we help artists to do. And because we actually work across the galleries, but we also work with museums, that's a really interesting part of the practice. We also work with universities and do research, and that's another opportunity for collaborating with artists and creating a network of practice and support. And I think that if you are from a diverse background, you're likely to be underrepresented in that you need support, and you need to perhaps reconceptualize what you mean by the art world outside of the market,
Yeah, it's interesting talking about that intersection of the art market versus the community that sits around an artist studio. I think for myself, actually, one of the things that helps give context when you're looking at work, from a collection perspective, is that to know art is really exceptional, or an artist has that career trajectory ahead of them, is actually hearing about them through their network. Like, I think for young artists, the biggest champion of their work is going to be the young artists who are their peers. If I hear about a young artist from a number of different other artists, I'm like, oh, they must be doing something really quite special if everyone else is championing them and speaking about that.
Yeah. I mean, it's very important to support other artists, to sort of create your own sort of community, your supporting community. There's a sort of a thing about sort of, art karma of, if you go to shows and support artists, they'll kind of come and support you as well. And that is absolutely true. I mean, I've put in, there's a lot of kind of groundwork with that you have to go to a lot of exhibitions. You really have to kind of show up and support and create those conversations and really engage, and you will get that back. And so, that is a really, really, really important thing. I mean, kind of just sort of working on Instagram or just liking something on Instagram isn't really going to make those connections. You do have to kind of start those conversations. And I've seen some amazing artists at work, the way that they've kind of physically networked. I mean, I remember going to an art auction, and he went very, very prepared. He's actually a very successful artist. And and if someone was bidding on an artwork, he would look at them, and then when that was finished, he would just go straight over to them, just sort of get out the card and just go, "I'm an artist. You're going to like my work," And he and he would start a conversation, and that's really kind of what you have to do. And he took all those opportunities where he could to build that kind of database of connections, because that's what it is. It's creating a sort of useful database.
Yeah, the other thing I want to mention is this definition of emerging artists is different for different people. Basically, it takes longer for some people to emerge than others. And there's people that have, if the kind of stereotype, you come out of art school and you're going to get a show, and then it's going to, and there are artists that have gone into their 50s, 60s, even older than that, before they've actually been internationally recognised and get their first big show. So I think that whole thing about who is an emerging artist and what point in your life or career, I think is a different thing for different people.
No, I think that's a good context to give, and that idea of emerging really is the process and build up as you work towards that really broad audience. Julie, you spoke a little bit briefly there about the role of Instagram and the digital. I think when we're talking about networking, you'd mentioned also the auction house and being there physically in person, and I think going to openings, going to peer exhibitions. Those are all spaces for those initial conversations, but maybe we can talk a little bit about the difference of building a relationship within the digital community. Is there a place for that? Do you see that as something that's been productive even over the last 2 years? Have there been spaces where that digital community building has existed? And then, Gareth, maybe you can also speak a little bit about some of the risks of the digital community building.
Yeah, I mean, need I say the word clubhouse? I think that's a good start, isn't it? There's an organisation that developed sort of its USP pretty much about 12 to 24 months ago, and it was the sort of the location, the digital location for all sorts of kind of Discord chats and discussions, etc. And really, I mean, it's almost no longer existent. So I think there's a kind of an interesting discussion around the sort of the hybridity of having a digital presence, but also maintaining, as Julie and Errol have mentioned, the physicality of your personal network. And I think part of that is, as Julie's mentioned, also really, really insightful in the fact that often it's the artists that will be those that extol the virtues of other artists, and that sort of that extolation of virtue is exactly what the market likes to listen to quite steadily. So if you maybe take the example of, for instance, a primary, so first sale contemporary gallery, perhaps a reasonably large name, they'll be receiving unsolicited submissions from dozens of artists a week. And so there's a chance that they may not have the time to perhaps, to be as assiduous with each of the submissions. But one way of kind of circumventing that is by relying on some of the artists that they perhaps already represent. And, if they are mentioning things about an interesting artist doing interesting things, then, all eyes are on sort of what that person is doing. So it's kind of keeping that sort of that dynamism within your sort of your creative network network, which is, I think, really important. And as I think as Julie's also mentioned, it's, there's a bit of karma there. So you turn up to your friend, turn up to your associates' opening, because they'll turn up to yours, and eventually those dynamic discussions will start to kind of filter through to other ears, which may be able to provide a kind of more of a kind of a market angle on these sorts of things. But also, of course, making sure that you follow the right people, making sure that your posts and your comments and your digital presence are well targeted, are thoughtful, and are things that are kind of useful, and to develop discussions, I think is really, really important. So sometimes in the digital sphere, sometimes less is more, perhaps, and making sure that you curate those aesthetics can be quite useful.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, that less is more. I mean, and also deciding on what you are prepared to really undertake, because there are so many platforms. I mean, we talk about Instagram, but obviously there are just so many platforms. And I mean, if you really did do them all and put all the work in, you just have no time. And if you're tending to your media, in your media presence more than your actual practice, then you're doing something completely wrong. If the only thing that you sort of create in a day is like hashtags and, things like that, you're not going to get very, very far. So, I mean, I would say just, if you're very uncomfortable with it or you don't really enjoy it, I really dislike it, then just pick like the one that you find most workable, and then just do that one, and just allow, like, say, I'm going to do 15 minutes on this, or I'm going to do that. But also use the digital gateway of that conversation to actually turn that into something more physical, like the idea of making content that you can go and meet another artist. So you could do, a post where you go meet another artist, or go to do a studio visit, and turn digital content, which is great content, into something that actually. Exactly. That you get a lot more out of doing it. You have to get out of your studio as well, because that is not an exciting world. Just being in that room.
Yeah, there's different aspects to the digital engagement of art, isn't there? I mean, there's social media. So Julie's made the point about how much time you do it, but the digital could be the artwork, or we've got NFTs, and it's moving to that. I mean, when I was at the Slade, I mean, there were some people there whose work, their practice, was in the digital space. It did not have a physical
for
manifestation.
Sure. I've gone to studio visits where the work was made for Instagram, and it didn't exist in the studio.
Exactly. Yeah. So I think we've got to just get to grips with that, and to have a way of assessing that kind of practice the same way that we would in the physical world, and then there's the experience of the artwork. And so I got this email from somebody last week, and it was about the Parthenon sculptures, and there's this row that's broken out with the British Museum because. Everybody knows the story about the Parthenon marbles, but somebody wants to do high-res scanning so that they could be shown in other places. The BM has blocked it, but it's a really interesting thing about how you experience these amazing artworks, whether, in fact, the people who are doing it are saying that the quality of the scanning that they're going to do is going to allow you to see things that you cannot actually see with the physical object. So it's a really interesting, the way that digital is going.
And I think it's something that a lot of artists are, as you're coming out of school and choosing what mediums you want to work in, the digital is a medium just as much as print or paint, but it becomes, what's the work that you want to make, and is that the right medium for you? And with every medium comes its own limitations and risks as well. Gareth, I know a number of young artists who've been working in the digital realm and have also seen, maybe some copyright proliferation of their image in spaces where they didn't intend it to go. Can you speak about that just a little bit for any of the artists who are starting to work in digital space, of things that they can do just to keep their copyright or integrity? Because I think that's an issue that's coming up with this medium.
Without a doubt, I couldn't agree more. And I think it's really important to be cautious as an emerging or as an artist who's developing their professional trajectories within the digital sphere, because it really is a kind of a case of this. There's a sort of a bit of a trope called right-click save, and the idea that you could effectively copy ad infinitum media that's created by an artist or creative practitioner. So in a sense, there's sort of on the one hand, there's a sort of caution to be considered as far as, if you are uploading or if you are disseminating your cultural output via a JPEG, via a WAV file, whatever it might be, just thinking about what the potential future knock-on effects or connotations of that might be. So thinking about when you're looking at the sites that you might be uploading to, do spend a little bit of time looking at the terms and conditions. I think we've maybe spoken about that a little bit in the series, but just really being sort of aware of, at the end of the day, kind of who actually maintains custody of the thing that you upload. Yes, you're the creative practitioner, but when it's sitting in a server farm somewhere, who actually has the future rights over that content? And something maybe just to consider quite sort of carefully. The other thing, maybe we're going to, obviously we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the tokenization of digital content, we've all heard about NFTs, etc. Has a wonderful opportunity for emerging artists. And it's also got there's a few little pitfalls here and there. I'm sure if we asked everyone in the room, everyone's got a view on this discussion. But I think one thing that sort of comes to mind as far as the revolution, that kind of digitalization of the last sort of 24 months now, would be the fact that a token, a kind of an NFT as it were, does effectively act as a sort of a digital certificate of authenticity, a COA of that content. Sure, the actual digital file is effectively not the NFT, unless we're talking about autoglyphs and that kind of thing, but the actual token enables the person to be the owner of that kind of string of alphanumeric sort of characters. And I think that does offer quite a lot of opportunity for artists to think about ownership and possession of what it is that digital file might actually be going forward. Be that your profile pic on your Twitter handle, be that as just something that you print out or you place in a room and it cycles around, etc. So I think that is an opportunity for artists to explore. I would be fascinated to know at MFA level what the discussion around this NFT topic, etc., is right now, because I wonder, thinking about some of the larger arts colleges in London, for instance, is this discussion being skewed towards traditional creative practice, or is it being accepted and kind of, should we say, incorporated into the curricula, especially if we are seeing a kind of a proliferation of digital media-based content. I'm really, really interested to see how that's pushing aesthetics forward, because I think there's a period sort of in kind of the mid-2010s where there were some galleries who are known as specifically digital media or moving image galleries, primarily selling these artifacts to museums, and I wonder whether or not their business models weren't as robust as maybe the options that are available now. So I wonder if when we're sort of looking forward, we're going to be seeing the digital, I guess, manifestation of culture really kind of hitting its straps and becoming more and more of a sort of a daily part of our lives. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, people ask me, what do you think of, sort of buying digitally and all this, and I just sort of think it's just beginning. I mean, I don't see it as something that's just going to fade out, or the novelty of it will just kind of pass. This is just such like the infant stages of something that is essentially will dominate, and I'm not against it, because especially when I work with sort of young graduating artists, I understand the appeal of digital art. I understand that the cost of making it is so much easier. You don't have to store it. There are just so many reasons why digital art is just more accessible for an artist to make in a real world, in a sort of logistical way. And also, I have a son who's 16, and I see the way that he interacts with what is digital and how meaningful the digital world is to him, where I'm like going, what are you? Why would you want to buy that? When he's on his Minecraft, because he'll kind of remember it started with things like Minecraft. You'd be buying all your bits, and it was a real world. You would really get involved in it. But then I started to sort of like recalibrate my brain to understand what they get from that, what enjoyment they're getting from that digital experience, how they're able to access it, how they're able to sort of buy things and have things without needing a physical space to put them in, just the accessibility of it. And I've started to sort of gradually understand it rather than just being like, what is this crazy, mad thing, buying Gucci trainers as NFTs or whatever to put on your Instagram posts and stuff like that. But now I'm actually quite excited by it. And as somebody who was a photographer before moving into creation, I understand the cost effect of being able to work, how the ease of it, the accessibility. It kind of levels the playing field in so many ways that sort of having to have a financial support to work as a sort of, making huge oil canvases and having the studio space to do it and all that, it comes with a cost that, so the digital world does allow artists to make. And obviously a lot of artists who do have a physical practice also really enjoy moving into the digital sphere as well.
I wonder if we're getting to a point where we have to think about authenticity in a different way. And I wonder if art crime actually, the nature of investigating it is going to change, because how do we, the traditional ways of thinking of an art object as being authentic or real is now different. Does that mean it's different to track down fakes, for example?
Yeah, great. No, that's a good point, Errol. What should we do? How do we proceed? No, absolutely. I mean, the sort of the Web3 metaverse sphere is replete with risks, some of which some of you guys will be familiar with, ideas such as rug pulls and certain organisations that are sold to us to be entirely immutable suddenly become mutable overnight, which sometimes does happen. I think you're absolutely right. So wallets can get hacked. There's all sorts of kind of discussions that need to be pushed forward. I'm interested in thinking about all of this ecosystem from an insurance perspective on a Monday morning, and wondering whether or not insurance products will eventually emerge that will help to sort of protect us against some of these risks. Because if you kind of transplant the idea of the traditional gallery with the alarms and the picture and the authenticity and all that kind of thing, well, if you go on to say Decentraland or Sandbox, it's not too different now when you start to sort of see these metaverses. And so how do you ameliorate any risks associated with something being digitally kind of acquired? I think that area is an interesting area for where we're going to start to see things moving forward. Authenticity, of course, is a huge discussion in the digital ecosystem, and people could, for instance, you could create a piece of digital content, mint it as an NFT, one of one, happy days. Someone else could then right-click, borrow that digital file, and then mint it as an NFT a day later. And the only thing you've got standing between you and the forged, shall we say, object, asset, is the fact that the timestamp was at 24 hours earlier for the first NFT. And that's a sort of an interesting thing to think about. How do we value that? Is that original one perhaps more valuable than the 24-hour later one?
I do want to get into this idea of value, because I think it's something a lot of emerging artists have to navigate as they kind of grow in their career and have different points of success along the way. I think there's, when you graduate, there's the pricing that goes into understanding value, but then also as you have your first public institutional exhibitions, there's kind of these moments in time where pricing does become a conversation. And I think we're at Masterpiece Fair, there's a lot of transparency here around provenance and its effect on value and price. For emerging artists, I'm curious from your own experiences, what are those moments that artists should look for and reflect on, for those moments to reflect on thinking about value and pricing in their work, and what are good resources to start that conversation, but then keep it going throughout their careers as well, because we all know that evolves over time.
I mean, I would say from my experience, because I essentially work with graduating artists, is to right at that beginning point, wherever you are as an artist, at that sort of beginning point of where you say, right, this now is going to be my practice, and this is what I'm doing, is to just think about that consistency is the most important thing, because what you're trying to do is instill confidence in anyone that is going to invest in your work. So if your pricing is like, oh, well, I could get more for it if I sell it here, or I can sell it cheaper at my studio, or I'll do a deal and I'll do this, that is just that is really bad practice in terms of pricing your artwork. I would suggest that you you start at a sort of price once you've worked out what that price is, and then you can incrementally increase it, maybe like 10% or something over time, or a year after a big show or a solo show, or think about how you're going to do that kind of before you start. Because I remember this time I went to sort of like it wasn't a student show, but it was a graduating artist show, and I really loved his work, and I think this painting was like £6,000, and I thought it was amazing, and I was looking at it and I was thinking, well, I can't actually afford to buy it, but if I could, I would, and I did think it was worth it. And then he was talking to me, and then within sort of like 10 seconds of this conversation, he was like, but you can have it for £3. And I was a bit sort of like, oh my God, the thing is, can you imagine if someone else had bought that artwork for £6,000, and then someone else said that they bought a similar artwork and it was half the price, and this kind of thing, and people lose confidence in investing in you as an artist. What they want to do is they'll buy your work, they love your work, but what they really also like is the idea that they're going to feel confident that investment's going to kind of increase. So that's what you want to do, is to just create a very sort of confident level of investment in your artwork, because people won't mind paying for it if they know that is the price. They won't buy it if they think that it's going to change, or it's going to mutate, or it's just crazy pricing. So consistency is absolutely key when pricing your work as an artist. And like just take note of your pricing as well. Just keep a note of everything when you sell it, so that you know that you're staying on a certain sort of trajectory of pricing your work.
Also keep track of where it goes. I think the amount of young artists who I've talked to, or mid-career artists who are looking back on their career, might not always know where pieces have ended up. And that's just a good bookkeeping thing to track, of course, what you're selling for, but also who are your collectors over time, and where do pieces end up landing. Errol, you spoke a lot about that process of pricing and valuing your own time as an artist as well. I wonder if you can speak to that a little bit more, because it's...
Yeah, I was just thinking how many different interpretations of value there can be, because, before we came on, Julie and I were chatting about filling out Arts Council forms, and the word value is used, and they're not talking about the market, right? They're talking about...
cultural value.
Cultural value. And there are artists, of course, who are not playing the market game. They're not selling work in the private market. Their practice is funded through public commissions and so on. That's one set of interpretation. Then we've got, valuing your time. But when you were talking about the painting, one of the artists that I work with, he says that the art world, when you're in the emergent stage, is that you're involved in the gift economy. He calls it the gift economy. I think I did talk about this when talking about valuing your time, in the sense that there's this sort of notion that, especially early career, you're going to give something away free or less than it's worth or whatever, just to get your name out there or to get a certain opportunity. And I think the so-called art world is really good at playing this gift economy game and guilt-tripping people into saying, well, okay, I'll undervalue in return for something, that may or may not accrue at a later date. So I think it's along with authenticity, I think value is one of those really slippery concepts in the art world to deal with, actually.
And I think the ideas of value often do overlap. Like, I think about a pricing value that you might see on a tag for something for sale, but it is so deeply impacted and influenced by cultural value. And what, for myself, defends the value behind an artwork is those moments of, is this going to be a piece that has cultural value along the way? Because in a lot of ways, that's what's going to allow that piece that value that's been given to it on a price tag to maintain over time. If a piece of art doesn't have cultural value or isn't part of a larger conversation in 50, 100 years from now, then it is more an object than than part of a social conversation. So I think that the confluence of both social value and price are really important to think about. And it's those moments where for an emerging artist, where their work touches on cultural value, that's when you start to say, maybe it's time to raise a price 10% or shift something slightly.
Yeah, I often think back to when I did politics and economics and the surplus value. If you start applying that idea to the making and selling of artworks, I mean, you start to think that the valuation of artworks is a kind of bizarre aberration in our world, that has absolutely no relationship to how much it costs or even the shifting, even if you say that the value is to do with its status or provenance or whatever, how that can just seesaw according to the art market, or how the artist is valued, and the impact of museum shows and collectors on value. It's a really topsy-turvy, crazy world, and some people can play it better than others.
It is a topsy-turvy, crazy world.
I'd like, if I can, just jump in on this, because I love the idea, the discussion around utility value of a sort of a non-useful good, shall we say. I mean, it's such a reductive concept. But I think about it, if you post a package to someone on the other side of the world or what have you, you've got to put a price on what the value of the thing in there is. And if it's cards and pictures, then you think, well, hang on, what is that actually worth? Okay. Now, Corey, you mentioned quite interestingly the idea of social value as well, which is something I think is really important. We're collectively here. There's that's a really intangible component of value. There's a little bit of literature on the symbolic nature of pricing, and I think that's a really it does sound quite abstract, but I think it's quite important, as Julie's mentioned, with the idea of consistency, because I think if you look at a price as something that's not just sort of a transaction cost, but it's something that stands for something. There's an economist, Torsten Veblen, who talks about the Veblen effect, which is effectively the higher something is under certain circumstances, the more desirous it becomes for certain people, just because of the symbolic nature of the high price. So kind of becoming very sober and sort of rationalising ourselves from an emerging artist perspective is being consistent at your price point. So if it's £5,000 for something, a slightly larger one might be slightly more, slightly smaller one might be slightly more. But I think maintaining that kind of, no, I'm not going to undercut myself by 50% because I'm worth it. The materials cost X, my time costs Y, my education perhaps costs Z, therefore I'm going to maintain that consistency. I think that actually that emanates a sense of professionalism from an emerging artist, which I think a lot of galleries and dealers, etc., find quite attractive. If you're going to think about signing someone on, you're going to represent them for their career, hopefully, you don't want them to be kind of risking potentially some sort of subverting their price point or their market by doing something on the weekend for this person and something on the weekday for that. But you kind of want to have that narrative quite sort of structurally sound. And so acting as professionally as possible as an artist coming out of maybe art college, for instance, I think that sort of sets you in a really good trajectory towards sort of attracting some eyeballs and some ears.
Oh, thank you. I think I absolutely agree with the comments made around consistency, and it can be a difficult thing to maintain. If you're really wanting to get a piece out, you have to make rent to pay for your studio. $3,000 instead of $6,000 can be a really tempting thing, but I think for any artist, it's thinking really long term about the impacts of those decisions. I have one last question before we go to the broader audience, but you'd mentioned it's a topsy-turvy world, this art world, and there's a lot of different kinds of success that come with it. There's highs and lows of selling work, exhibiting, having a productive conversation with the curator. I guess I'd love to hear from each of you just to think about goal setting as someone is thinking about their career. What are moments of time that they should look to kind of aspire to, or think about as they, define what success means to them in their field. Maybe if there's artists that you've worked with who've had kind of those moments to step back and say, oh, I did this well, or and if you could all kind of speak to that briefly, it'd be really, I think, helpful.
I mean, I think one of the most important things for an artist to do is sort of create momentum, keep momentum. It's one of the most important things to move forward as an artist. And kind of, I've seen so many artists who have kind of gone back and reworked work, or gone back and tried to sort of reevaluate, and they kind of get stuck in a hole where they just can't kind of move forward because they start to lose confidence because they go, oh, I don't like this today, or this doesn't work. And all the successful artists that I've seen that have created meaningful practices and have sustained a practice have kind of almost treated their practice a little bit like a business, in the sense that they'll create a project of work, a body of work, and maybe it will sell, maybe it won't sell, maybe people will be very critical of it, maybe people will love it, but it kind of exists, and then they move on from there. And if I had to give any advice from what I've seen from artists' practices, is the constantly moving on, moving forward, engaging, collaborating, exploring, creating a sort of energy around your practice. So creating kind of milestones, or thinking about your practice, think about where you start, where you want to be in a year, where you want to be in 2 years, 3 years, and not sort of think about creating a perfect thing or creating your masterpiece, because it's just never going to happen, and everything, you know, art is so subjective. It's just crazy to think that there is that, but you just to keep going, and just to learn from everything that is a disaster, everything that works, everything that doesn't work. That's I think that's success, is knowing how to move on from there and keep moving on from there, and just to keep going, because being an artist, it's a lifestyle choice, and so I think success is still being an artist after like 1 year or 5 years, and still being able to pay rent at the end of the day. I mean, that is successful. And the successful artists that I know, they all still have side hustles. They do talks, they assist, they do, you know, lots of things. So so I think, you've got to keep that momentum. Momentum is, I think, is everything.
Of that 5-year plan, and a momentum of change, because I think I've also seen moments where artists, maybe there's a lot of commercial success in a moment, and then the practice doesn't evolve or change over time. It just kind of,
because you want to keep recreating that,
over time, 10 years down the line, you're actually at a point of stagnancy, not success. So thinking broadly is really important. Errol, what are your thoughts on, or advice for those looking to navigate success?
I was thinking about failure, actually, and wrong note. No, there's I think it was Art Tatum, the pianist, who said, there's no such thing as a wrong note. It just depends which note you play after that. And I think that especially with the artists that we work with, there is this issue about interpreting failure or assessing one's success in relation to dominant examples, you know. And I remember once Hans Ulrich Obrist, he did this talk called Unrealised Projects, and he got all these people to talk about these projects that never happened. And it was really, really fascinating about how I think you can use failure or the unrealised, something that has not worked, actually, and how that can lead on to something that is really interesting and that does earn you money or whatever. But I think that you just have to embrace the fact that one's career is never linear and straightforward. There are accidents, there are pitfalls and so on, and it's how you deal with those, interpret those, and go on to the next thing. And in fact, things that I've done actually in my career that I thought were abject failures, and I think I actually learned so much from that, and that enabled me in the next project to apply the learning. So I think,
I think maybe to continue on with what Errol's saying, I think just actually that success moment might actually be happening kind of right now if you're an artist. It's the idea of being able to take stock and sort of self-reflexively consider what it is and how it is that you would define success. Because we're talking about, on one hand, it could be surviving an afternoon crit on a Friday with your colleagues. Another example could be successfully receiving public funding for a sculptural commission. Other people might be, for instance, say, gaining gallery representation at a particular time of your one's career, or getting a show at Venice at the right time of year, all that kind of thing. And so maybe I think actually sort of just objectively considering, and maybe even writing down, what are sort of in the next, say, two years, what do you want to have as kind of milestones as far as how you might perceive a sort of a successful career trajectory? One could argue that just being a creative practitioner is, and if you can sustain yourself, is success in and of itself for many sort of individuals. And so if you want to pursue a 60, 70, 80-year career, well, what do you how will you sort of, manage and, understand where and when it is that you've managed to get to where you want to get to, and remaining flexible at the same time. You may not quite get to Venice in your career, that's absolutely fine, but in actual fact, you may create a sculpture that has an impact that you've got no idea the ramifications of at another point in your career. So, these sort of things that a little bit of self-reflexivity and professionalisation, I think, can go a long way.
Self-reflexivity is certainly something important, especially when you're always outputting into the world. I think with that, though, I'd love to open it up to any questions from the audience or online. I see a few questions have already come in digitally, so maybe I'll start there, and then if there is anyone in the room who has a question, if you can put your hand up. I see a number of questions already starting. Hurrah. Okay. So maybe we can start in the room then.
Hi. You spoke about the importance of community and physical networking as an emerging artist. I've just graduated from the RCA, where they had a really conservative response to COVID, and we were largely not allowed on campus. And I basically wondered if you could talk about the impact of COVID on emerging artists and how to move forward, if galleries are considering it, that sort of thing.
That's a great question. Obviously very pertinent. Is there anyone who wants to kind of start with that, or? Yeah,
actually, we had a real challenge with that, with particular projects that we were doing during the COVID period. And as you know, all the live things were cancelled. And we decided to actually treat it as a sort of opportunity in a way to look at, how we could still deliver a programme remotely, and given what we were just talking about in terms of physical and digital, to retain the physical actually in a remote sense. So it was a research project actually. It was a collaboration with the university, and it was a direct response to COVID and what was happening in care homes. So we commissioned artists to make works that were going to go in a box, and these boxes were mailed out on a monthly basis to a select number of participating care homes. As you know, they were absolutely devastated by the COVID pandemic, but it created this really interesting opportunity to relate to an audience that wouldn't have been able to go to the galleries anyway had they been open. And we created these series of opportunities for artists in different media. There was film, music, and there was 2D art as well. So I think it's a challenge, but I think it was a really interesting opportunity as well.
Maybe I'll also kind of give some notes on that. I think it's something that I feel really aware of as someone who would normally go to a lot of graduating shows and see things in person. But one of the things that I also see is important as artists are coming out of institutions is what's the network that they're creating in that year after, 2 years after. And I know, well, I'm based in Toronto, but I've seen a lot more exhibitions or programs where it's artists getting together, showing work, supporting each other, maybe renting out a space for a week or two. And in the past, that's also been done, and I've always found that that's kind of a marker of, well, what artists are there already supporting each other, building their community and network, and being ambitious about that, because it's those artists who I know will also have the support to, find a studio and have the conversations that they need for their work to progress. So, if you're in a position where you have colleagues and peers that have also gone through maybe missing out on some of the in-person studio conversations, I think there is a lot of opportunity to still, bring people in. And I think anyone who works in the arts, curators, and institutional or otherwise collectors are also all thirsty for it and want to see, well, who are the artists that we might have missed, and what are they doing to bring their work back into the world. So I guess with that, it's not easy, but to know that there's a hunger for it, and that also creating opportunities for people to engage with your work outside of that, university space, but rather maybe more in a pop-up or private space is still something really legitimate and desired and exciting. Should we go to another question in the room? We have one right here.
Hi, good morning. My name is Joyce Maloney. I'm from Ireland. I started a movement in 2017 called Story Emotionalism. For the simple reason I found it very hard to break into the fine art market both in Ireland and in England. So since then, I've also branched into digital art. During lockdown, I upskilled. For the simple reason, in 2020, March 2020, I was standing in my kitchen having a cup of coffee, and over the radio came on, Beeble's work was sold. And I was standing there going, oh my God, for somebody that is still living to accumulate such wealth for a piece was momentous in any shape or form. So basically, as I stood there, I was listening. And the piece was digital. I suppose the currency was digital. The auction was digital, but the transaction was very, very much real. And he walked away with 53 million from that. So I basically came today, thank you for inviting me. But I came today for the simple reason. I graduated in 1998 from the Crawford College of Art and Design in Cork. And during that time, as an artist, we were never exposed to business models, marketing, how to put yourself forward, how to actually use strategies to contact people instead of cold calling and so on and so forth, which I don't think has actually moved on. I mean, that's nearly 3 decades ago, and it's still nothing is really happening to push forward to, I suppose, educate the new generation of artists coming out. And I mean, media and digitalization. I was in New York 2 weeks ago, and my work was in Times Square. So I've come a long way from the fine art. I actually got recognition far faster in the digital world than the fine art world. But the momentum that was there, I went to different talks and discussions and so on and so forth across New York. But the energy and enthusiasm for DAOs coming on and so forth, that's how I got my work to be displayed in Times Square, is because I became involved in a group of artists that wanted to stand alone, decentralized autonomous organization to display the work called the metaversal letters. But to be fair, the thoughts and the momentum around the whole group was the decentralization of it. And I mean, I was like, yes, yes. I mean, it took me nearly 3 decades to get recognition to where I am today, because it was actually far easier to be accepted on different levels than try to permeate the fine art world of even 5 years ago. Now, I mean, I'm successful enough in my IRL, my real work, my traditional work. I've had 2 solo shows in New York. I've shown in LA. I was shortlisted here at the King's Cross for the Ruth Pritchard Prize. It's not like I haven't had a level of success, but you're constantly beating on a drum. But I think if you can install in the youth coming on that we are media entrepreneurs going forward. We're not artists anymore because we are embracing the digital. I mean, I suppose I've changed my name to Joyce Maloney, NFT evangelist, for the simple reason an NFT is a digital deed, Gareth, yeah. But at the end of the day, if somebody buys my work tomorrow morning, I know that the dip in digital currency has gone through the ground, but that's only the dust probably before the dawn, and most banks now are, across Europe, considering digital currency going forward. But I would definitely advocate for artists to mint their work as NFTs, because say if somebody bought your work for 10,000 tomorrow and you become uber famous overnight, you can still monetize a percentage of that work going forward. And I don't think people understand that as well. So Gareth, I direct that question to you.
Thank you, Joyce. A lovely question. I'll try and work out where the question is, but what I think is...
The fact that the artists can monetize...
Yeah, totally. Yeah. So the fact that artists can get an on-ramp into a sustainable career via tech routes rather than, say, traditional art market, and I totally agree with you. It's one of these sort of wonderful things. It's kind of a catch-22. Jean Renoir's The Rules of the Game is an example of, if you don't know the rules of the art trade, then how are you ever going to try and make it in that ecosystem? Well, you can of course go to Sotheby's Institute of Art and take a course on some of these topics. But no, I totally agree with you. I think that there are so many opportunities in the digital ecosystem. There are so many how-tos, effectively, that you can just join a couple of Discord chats, a couple of Twitter groups, etc. And before you know it, you will be learning things that you didn't know that you needed to learn in order to then turn your practice into perhaps a financially successful model. It sounds like you're doing really well, and that's really cool. So actually, this is sort of where the kind of the maybe traditional art, should we say, fine art degrees might be listening a bit more. Okay, so you've got people coming out, and what is the success rate of an artist after MFA? Success, of course, define that, but not every artist that matriculates can be represented by Gagosian, nor should they want to. But how can you kind of increase those percentages, and is actually opening yourself up to a kind of a digital opportunity that's just emerged in the last 24 months or thereabouts, or become mainstream? Maybe that's your shortcut getting in there. The thing I think I would say is just be sure that you know where you're going on that journey. So don't, lots of opportunities will emerge for you to sell NFTs here and there, etc. Just think about your career as a kind of a strategic kind of process. So buying and selling quickly might be really wonderful right now, but it could potentially cause pitfalls sort of down the way, as it were.
But I listened to Julie, and it's better to work project-based. This beautiful being a project. Start means and ends, and you move forward. And as Earl said, failure isn't a failure. It's actually just a stepping stone. And I mean, you do evolve from your failures. The best of the world evolve from your failures.
Absolutely. Yeah. No.
As Earl said, yes, and definitely the music is made between the notes.
I do actually want to just pick up on one of the things you said there that goes back to a question that's come in through our live stream, which is, which digital networks would speakers recommend for intelligent and informed discussions? So you mentioned Twitter, you mentioned Discord. I think is there anywhere you've seen people go to have some of those conversations in the digital sphere?
It's the kind of the classic wheat for the chaff scenario, isn't it? So you've only got a certain amount of time in your life, and you could probably spend a lot of that time looking at sources that may not have the integrity of how can kind of get you moving forward. I think one way of trying to reduce the risks here is to look at artists that you respect, that have digital profiles, that are doing interesting things in the space, and what channels are they looking at? Okay, there are millions of Discord channels that you could be part of, but it's finding the kind of the 1, 2, or 3 that kind of resonate with you. That's a good start, I think. Just getting a kind of a sense of, at least someone that you respect is also aware of the information that's coming through the ecosystem, and then through that, it's kind of sort of a little bit rabbit hole. You'll end up being invited to other channels that might be exclusive communities, and then you start to sort of get a little bit of maybe what you might call sort of digital insider information. So yeah, I would say start with thinking about who you respect in the space, and then just sort of where they're moving, where they're nudging towards. A little bit like, you know, in the real world, what artists are doing interesting things and what galleries they're working with.
Anyone else have any secret
Discord
accounts?
It's definitely quality over quantity. I mean, you know, it's just the right. You only need a few really important connections to make all the difference, rather than having, you know, 10,000 followers. It's you know, how do you put a value on these things? I mean, what is really going to work for you in your practice? What is a necessity in your practice? If your practice is digital, then you're going to need something different to somebody who needs a physical space to show their work. Someone who doesn't even have work to sell, or who just does site-specific installation, it has to be, you know, physically seen. So maybe you're not even really interested in going down those routes. I mean, it's a real horses for courses type.
I think that goes back.
Type thing, and it's constantly changes. I mean, I don't really like to go on Instagram, and every time I go on it, it's changed. I'm like, I have no idea. What's this new thing? I've done it. You know, I'm like, I'm the worst person to be doing sort of, you know, digital marketing, and it's a skill in itself. I mean,
it is a skill in itself, but I think it's also, as you said, finding peers with similar areas, trajectories, mediums.
Yeah.
Where are they looking? You know, where have their peers looked, and it is that network building that helps those conversations. Should we go to another question in the room? Yes.
Hi, my name is Chike Azonia. I'm a painter, I'm an artist. Thank you for inviting me. The question I'm going to ask later is for Julie and Errol. I know, just correct me if I'm wrong, I think I read somewhere that 75% of artists in the UK work and also paint. They're kind of it's a hybrid kind of life, and it's been going on for as long as you know, one can imagine. And when I hear the term emerging artist, and Eros said it, that you think of people graduating from universities or art schools, but there are older people who have been knocking on the door for many, many years, and it seems that they've been locked out of. It's like the art world is like it's very snobbish. That's how people look at it. There's a kind of snobbery, and as an artist, I can tell you, I know a number of artists, maybe including myself, you know, because I'm not the top listen that I can be if the doors are opened to places where I would like to be. I have a number of friends who, for many years, have been trying to get into the, galleries, big galleries, and they've only managed to do it when in their 80s, you know, when they've been struggling for the past 40, 50 years. It's not, there's something wrong somewhere. So the question I'm asking is, we can't just, you know, put a blind eye to it and say it's okay. It's not okay. I think my question is there any element of luck in this whole thing? This question is to Julie, because I know you talked about it, so that's why I want to direct it to you. And thanks to Errol for bringing up this issue. You know, yeah. So at times it's like you know, a number of very good artists are locked behind doors for many, many years, and there's so many of them. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, when you say 75% of artists, I'm amazed it's only 75%. I would imagine it's probably easily. I mean, because it is incredibly difficult, but it's a choice that artists make to, you know, have a certain lifestyle in which they're going to go, well, as long as I can, you know, support myself, then this is what I do, because this is meaningful to me. This to be creative and engaged in the world is meaningful, and creating that conversation in your work. Is that more important than commercial success, making the artwork? How important is it to you? But obviously, you need a certain amount of success in order to, maybe gain some income from doing that, or to get funding and to do your work through different ways, through not necessarily being in a gallery. There are many other ways in which you can be a successful artist that isn't through gallery representation or having a gallery work with you. You can kind of curate your own program, and you can do your own funding, and you can do it that way. But what essentially funding bodies will look for is critical rigor about your practice. So it's very important that if you're not going to go through the normal channels, as you were saying, of doing a degree, and then that's a kind of set up system. I go to degree shows, I look for artists. But if you're going to come around it another way, then you have to sort of apply that same critical rigor to your practice that you would be applying to, which is expected of you through a college degree, a fine arts degree, and that is what people will always look for. So one way of doing it to kind of beat the sort of gallery system is maybe look of ways of sort of collaborating with other artists to build that critical rigor, doing more artist talks about your work. Maybe think about where, if you have a studio, what kind of studio, what other artists are working in that studio. Maybe there's a better studio that you could be working in to sort of start building that sort of conversation about your work. But being a successful artist, I really wouldn't think that it's just about being in a gallery or having a gallery recognize your work, because what they are doing is different to what you're doing. What a gallery is looking forward to do. It may be a financially driven gallery. It may be a totally different type of gallery. It might be a foundation. There are lots of reasons. They all have different motives in the way that they will select an artist and use them. So you don't necessarily have to sort of think, well, getting gallery representation is the way to go. There are other ways that you can be a well-noticed, successful artist that other artists are talking about by kind of doing it yourself with working with maybe businesses, establishments, doing collaboration with another artist. Doing it that way, that's still very valid to sort of get you to sort of cement your place in the art scene, as it were, which is really what artists want, isn't it? It's just to sort of be recognised and be in that conversation, in that scene. But sometimes you have to create your own scene if you're not doing it by the more sort of known routes. But I've certainly worked with a lot older artists that have come to it much later in life. So I worked with a fantastic artist. She'd already had a career and her family, and she had worked as a sort of air stewardess for like 20 odd years, and then she decided that actually she was an artist. And she's one of the most amazing artists that I've worked with. She did go back to do an MA because it was at a point in her life that she wanted the pleasure of doing the MA, but it wasn't because she felt like she needed the MA to be recognised as an artist. She just did it because she had the time and she was in that sort of space in her mind that that's what she wanted to do, and she's doing absolutely phenomenally well. So. Yeah, that answers the question.
I think you went back to an important point, though, around emerging artists is not defined within an age bracket, and I think that's something I just also want to speak to from the RBC Emerging Artists perspective. The funding that goes to museums and institutions that support residency programs, exhibitions for emerging artists through this program is not tied to age, but rather where the artists are in their career, and making sure this is an opportunity that will take them to that next level and help them gain a new audience. And I think the question around age is really a visible and important conversation right now, and it's challenging institutions to also reflect on their own programming through that.
Yeah, I mean, you asked about luck. It involves a lot of bad luck as well. And you have to, I think it's a different, there's different games being played with careers, so there is the stereotype of coming straight out of art school and you go into a gallery and you get your shows and it's up there, and in a lot of those cases, those careers are not sustainable, actually. And some of the examples that you gave about artists who've taken a long time to be discovered, actually they have produced some of the most solid bodies of work. They've made the mistakes and done the consistency that Julie was talking about, and they've got this amazing body of work. I mean, how many people knew about James Barner before that massive show at the Serpentine? Now, he's been collected for a long, long time. I'm not sure that his work would have been very saleable in the art market at the time that he was starting work. He was documenting a subject matter that I don't think the art world was particularly interested in anyway, and I think his time is now, you know. And there are lots of artists like this, and there is advantages to not being discovered, actually, and dealing with something that is not really commercially trendy, basically. I mean, I think there's a practice that is about that, and there's another one that engages with the zeitgeist and does everything really, really quickly. So I think there's a choice to be made. It's strategic, and it can depend on how much that part-time job, you know, whether, you know, like Gauguin, you know, it can support you into that point where your work is selling, you know, so they're variable games. Yeah.
We have another question in the audience.
Thank you very much, and it's been really helpful to have all your advice. I'm a little bit of an outsider in the room. I'm a professor in biology, but I was bequeathed 100 pieces of art from my father, and this idea of emerging, so I'd like to continue that conversation even further. Any advice? I mean, my original thought was, as a scientist, I should document all the work and maybe make a textbook, a book out of my father's work. But what is your advice for trying to get somebody's artwork into the world who's no longer here? Any advice? I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. It's a great question.
I guess the first question would be, are these works by an artist who's no longer here, is that correct? Yes. Okay, yeah. I think it's...
Who really had a career in, I mean, he only did artwork, so he was in his studio, he never really got out, maybe a few shows, but mainly an artist who did art. Perfect.
So I would suggest, just on the outset, as you rightly suggested, document, catalogue, make sure you know exactly what you've got, and then put that in a couple of different places so it doesn't get lost in some way. Then from that point forward, I would think about what is the kind of the story that you are, you know, motivated to perhaps try to develop. Are there particular areas in which this person, you know, was interested in their life and might the work that they've created sort of synergize nicely with where you might see it being positioned. Additionally, I mean, if we're thinking about the canon of art history, for instance, you could do a lot worse than contacting maybe some art historians and asking their view on what the output, what the oeuvre looks like, if they've got any thoughts or comments about maybe artists who have been creating in a sort of a similar way, similar medium, that kind of thing, and just sort of getting a bit of a sort of kickstarting a critical voice about the work. I think that's a really, really good start. And just also make sure that you know where you are legally with regards to the ownership of the works, with regard to kind of, you know, are you going to incorporate the works as part of a trust? Are they physically owned by one particular person? That kind of thing. Just make sure that you know that when they start to hop around and be shown in different institutions, that you've got sort of bedrock as far as understanding who the owner is and you know, those kind of loan agreements and all that kind of thing. But it sounds like a really exciting proposition. Let us know how it's going.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Maybe we have time for one more question. I'm just seeing a hand up right in the front row. Is that okay?
Okay. So hi, I'm just graduated from Goldsmiths for photography, and I just in our university students, we also say that when you graduated, you are starting losing like your career or you. It's a kind of like a funny talk, but actually it is. When I graduated, like maybe last September, I started like trying to finding a job related to my photography arts or whatever like related. I didn't get back. So somehow I'm lucky because I invited to some gallery and do some exhibition, but in other way, I didn't like physically get response from the community or the art, I don't know, like art circle or something. And also photography is kind of like in between, not like CGI or VR. You have to use specific devices to develop, or like a painting, you have like physical parts. Photography is just like in between. Everyone can do it. Everyone is so easy to access it. So I was wondering, like, how are we able to sell to introduce our artwork in the value that people agree with?
I know I have some initial thoughts around just things like pricing photography. You know, you talked about it being this middle space, but I think there is something about still making sure that when you're thinking about things like editioning the work, that you're celebrating it as something, you know, precious and important. So similar to, you know, a physical print, making sure that you're only doing small editions. You're not printing 100, but rather, you know, 2 or 3, so that it really does become an object that has that rarity and value, is just the first thing that comes to mind. Because I see a lot of artists, you know, maybe they make a beautiful image, but they'll print so many of them, and commercially it's just not so viable. It becomes very commercial and less of an art object. But you spoke to kind of a lot around that graduating from school and the complexity of navigating that moment. I'm not sure if there's anyone else who kind of wants to jump in to...
But I mean, it does take a long time. I mean, I think there's this idea that as soon as you graduate, that's it. You're out, you know, you're running, that's it. You've got to make everything count. It's all got to happen really quickly because there's only a finite period of time. But it's not true. I know artists that have left, because I think there's the idea you'll come out of like your MA or your BA and you'll have a kind of like fully formed practice, and therefore you are a professional, and therefore you should be doing everything. You know, you have got like this professional setup and you are this fully fledged artist. It's not true. It's the beginning. It's the absolute beginning. And when I came out of my MA, I didn't know what I was doing. You know, I had this idea that the MA would kind of build me as an artist, but it didn't. It did the absolute opposite. I came out and I was like, oh my, I don't know where my practice is. This whole thing, you know, it's blown my mind. And so there is a sort of lot of sort of recalibrating yourself when you come out from doing a formal qualification in fine art. Then take that time to do that, and think about and strategize about how you're going to move forward. Really, I would just don't sort of respond to the pressure that you've somehow failed or can't make it as an artist because something immediately hasn't happened. It sometimes takes a very, very long time, and obviously life happens and you have to do other things, and artists, you know, spend ages having to sort of move out their studios and re-establish themselves and do that. I would take away that worry about trying to do everything what you think is the right time, and otherwise you've failed in some way that you failed. I would relax about that completely, and everything that Crow was saying about photography, because for ages photography, it really struggled to find its place in the art market because it just didn't have the value the way that someone would look at a canvas and say, well, obviously a canvas is a one-off, you can't recreate that canvas, but with photography you can make multiple images, and it was seen as much of a lesser art form, but not now. And so I agree absolutely about the idea of knowing how to sort of limit your work and add that value in through making it a scarce product, you know.
I may not have been paying attention, but I didn't hear you stressing art when you talked about photography. And it made me think, well, there are so many routes into fine art photography from other disciplines. So fashion, photojournalism, lots of other ways into it. So you describe it as this in-between genre, if you like, but that's what's interesting about it, the slippery nature of the different photographic disciplines and how they can lead into a fine art practice, but they may not start off as that. And there's many, you know, I'm just thinking of Jürgen Teller, for example, you know, coming from the fashion world into fine art photography. And actually, the Deutsche Bank photography prize that was recently on at the Photographers Gallery, one of the artists there was really interesting, the way that they were playing with the documentation of the Troubles in Ireland and bringing that back into a fine art practice. So I really, I think it depends on what you're trying to do, and it can arrive back into a serialized fine art, practice.
Yeah, this is what I'm trying to do now, because I've seen that a lot of fashion brands are inviting the photographer or like documentary photographer, maybe like 70s, 80 years old. So I see the possibility, so I'm trying to go to that industry to find out if there's a way. Yeah.
No, I think that's a really exciting space to explore those intersections that support your creative endeavor, but also can support you.
Because I see the possibility there.
I think if I could say one final point here, I would say be very aware of the different players that are in the photography as medium in the contemporary art ecosystem. So maybe get yourself a journal, write down some names of some galleries that are interesting, some photographers that are doing interesting things. Also, explore residency possibilities, explore kind of like ways in which maybe studio space, so if you haven't already, maybe think about getting one, and just keep very, very close to your graduating cohort of colleagues, because that's a really, really important thing to continue with as they move into the professional art trade or professional contemporary art ecosystem. They'll know you, you'll know them, and they'll sort of help kind of bring you through. But just maintain an awareness and continue to apply for things that might be small bursaries, small grants, often publicly funded, just sort of so that you're sort of lily padding. It is a verb, isn't it? Lily padding from one point to the other across the stream of life, in a way that sort of makes you become aware and also understand where you need to sort of get to, if you sort of understand what I mean.
I get it. Thank you so much. It's like my supervisor to guide me.
Well, thanks so much, and thanks for the questions in the audience and online today. I so appreciate all of the panelists' time and generosity in the conversation. And I think for those in the room, we can follow up with a few questions. I know I'll be here for a little while if there is anyone who wants to kind of follow up on that opportunity. But I think with that, thank you. And we so appreciate the opportunity to talk about emerging artists and what's next. Cheers.
Thank you.